This is the Transport Select Committee's pre-appointment hearing to enable the committee to question the Secretary of State for Transport's preferred candidate for the chair of the Civil Aviation Authority, the Aviation Regulator, and that's Sir Stephen Hillier. Sir Stephen, welcome.
Well, Chair, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for this opportunity to appear in front of the committee today. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. You asked me just to provide a few words by way of background. From my youngest years, I wanted to be a pilot in the Royal Air Force. I pursued that ambition, joined the Air Training Corps, got a flying scholarship and my private pilot's license. I was licensed by the CAA before I did anything else in my life at 17 years old. I then joined the Royal Air Force and had an amazing career, which I enjoyed every moment of, and just gave me fantastic opportunity, challenge, and responsibility. Eventually, I ended up as Chief of the Air Staff, the head of the Royal Air Force. I finished that appointment in the middle of last year, and somebody alerted me to the fact that the Department for Transport was looking for a new chair for the Civil Aviation Authority. And I just thought that my sort of career, the lifelong experience of working in aviation, working in highly regulated environments, and leading at the strategic level in complex and demanding positions, I felt that I had something to offer to be the chair of the Civil Aviation Authority, a tremendously important position. And I'm just delighted to have made it this far in the selection process, and I'm really excited about the potential, subject to the committee's views, the potential for taking over as the chair of the CAA in the very near future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sir Stephen. And as you'll be aware, then the reason for today is that the Select Committee has a sort of requirement to involve itself in the pre-appointment process, and so effectively we'll give you another interview on that basis. And I'll start before colleagues then take over. And can I ask you how well suited you think you are to this particular role?
Clearly it's been an extensive interview process and selection process, so others have made that judgment, along the way. From my perspective, it is that experience in a highly regulated environment, not just in relation to aviation safety and security, but more broadly as well. It is my lifelong involvement in aviation. It is my experience of leading large, complex organizations and chairing boards where difficult long-term and short-term decisions are required. That's my experience, and what I'm looking forward to is putting that experience to work, if you like, in the Civil Aviation Authority.
And Sir Stephen, do you mind just telling us how the process works in terms of did you see an advert in the paper? Did someone make you aware of it? How many rounds of interviews did you go through, and who were you interviewed by?
So it was not long after I'd finished as Chief of the Air Staff, perhaps a month or so afterwards, a friend alerted me to the public appointments website. I went to the public appointments website, and I have to say, when I saw this chair of the Civil Aviation Authority, and given my background, it just felt that, wow, this is a great potential opportunity. So I put my application in, probably I think about September last year. I don't know what SIFT process was gone through initially by the headhunters. Then I had an interview with them. I believe that went down to a short list of 6. There was an interview process for those 6. I'm not aware of any of the other candidates. From that process of 6, it went down to 3. Then there was an interview with the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State, I believe, made a recommendation, and that went to the Prime Minister, and I was notified of the Prime Minister's endorsement of my candidacy on the 4th of May, a month ago.
And so, Stephen, this is probably more a question for the Secretary of State, but in as much as you got the feedback, why do you think you became his preferred candidate?
Well, as you say, it's difficult for me to make that judgment. And as I said, I don't know who the other candidates were, and I'm sure they were excellent, and they would have also done a great job, I'm sure. I would hope that what made me stand out was that lifelong experience of aviation, that lifelong experience of safety risk management, and that experience of leading large and complex organizations, including chairing some significant boards. I would hope that those were things which made me stand out. But I do recognize along the way that, I mean, no candidate scores 10 out of 10 in every category. So I'm very much aware that there are areas where I don't have as much experience and where I need to learn and develop. And actually, that's quite part of the excitement of the journey that I'm on, is developing my skills in those areas. I don't believe that those areas there's anything unknowable in them, and I'm just keen to learn, and I'll make sure that in those particular areas that will be quite a focus in my early months in appointment.
Well, thank you, Sir Stephen. You've touched on the sort of knowledge, skills, experience side, and we're going to sort of delve a little further, and I'll ask my colleague Ruth Cadbury to do so.
Thank you, Chair. So Steve, you've got a distinguished record of service within the RAF and the military. Can you convince us that you've got sufficient knowledge of the civil aviation sector and the challenges facing the sector?
Well, thank you. As I mentioned earlier in my introduction, then I started off in civil aviation. That was my first flying experience. I progressed to get my private pilot's license and did flying after that. So I've been licensed by the CAA, and that preceded anything that I did with the Royal Air Force. Moving into my RAF career, the reality is that in military flying, you spend a very large proportion of your time either flying in normal airspace open to everybody, or in airways, in civil regulated airspace. And so I have that experience as well. Clearly, I haven't run an airline, although I would have to say that as the head of the RAF, I had an extensive fleet of large wide-body aircraft, passenger-carrying aircraft, which would put me number 3 in the country in terms of size of wide-bodied aircraft airline. So in all of that, there was a constant interaction with the CAA in terms of operating in that airspace. Now, again, I come back to, I'm not claiming that somehow I have that direct experience of running an airport, running an airline, but you know, it's an ecosystem, and that ecosystem of air traffic control, aircraft, ground handling, air terminals. There are so many similarities across the aviation enterprise that you know, and the complexities of that are very familiar for me.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So you've experienced the regulatory framework as a consumer, I guess, but now you're going to be running a regulatory authority, and you said you want to develop your knowledge of economic regulation as part of your preparations for joining the CAA. How are you going to go about doing this? So I've already started that by talking to people who are not within the CAA at the moment, but who have experience of economic regulation with the CAA's function in that respect. So I've started with the, if you like, the 101 of economic regulation. Why do we do it? How do we do it? What are we trying to achieve? So I've started that process now, and subject to the confirmation. As I mentioned earlier, that economic regulation is one of those areas where I know I need to grow my experience. There'll be some fantastic people at the CAA who have that experience at the moment, and I'm going to spend a lot of time talking to them on that. That also applies to consumer rights, is that, you know, I clearly have experience as a consumer myself. I've also got experience of looking after passengers, large volumes of passengers, as effectively an airline operator when I was in the RAF. But I need to develop that further as well. So those are two particular areas which are my focus. As I mentioned before, I think that it's entirely learnable. And in the way of these things, when you know that's an area that you don't have much experience, you pay much closer attention to it. You take that, a very high level of interest. I will undoubtedly be questioning and curious in that area, and I think that's absolutely what a regulator should be like anyway.
Thank you very much. My last question is, during your RAF career, you've served on a number of boards relating to defence investment, equipment and infrastructure. So what have you learned from the experience that you can bring to this role?
So, it's a great question, and that experience of running a board is, and chairing a board, I think is about making sure that you have the right board. And what I mean by the right board is the right range of experiences and perspectives and cognitive diversities around the table. That the board is presented with the right information it needs in order to make judgments and make decisions, and that all has to happen in a timely way. That as the chair of the board, it's my responsibility for creating the right environment so that we can have the right discussions. To be supportive of the executive, the people who are then going to implement those decisions, but then also to have a strong hold to account function, to make sure that people do what they said that they were going to do. Finally, the board needs to lead the organization, and then to do that, it needs to set the right culture and values and standards. What the board does is going to be what the character of the whole organization is like. So, I could probably talk for the next half an hour about what I've learned from chairing a board, but those, I would say, are the headlines.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair.
And continuing on this theme, Greg Smith.
Good morning, Sir Stephen, and can I start by saying thank you for the service you've given our country throughout the RAF, and indeed for wanting to continue in civilian public service. I've worked with quite a lot of people in the past, particularly my local government past, who have transferred from a uniformed service into civilian public service. And most of them have commented or said that it's been quite a big jump going from having a rank, a very strict hierarchy and ability to give direct orders to someone, to coming into a very different style of working. Can I ask what thoughts you've given to that change from a very strict hierarchy to this sort of environment, and how you're preparing to perhaps have to change your style a little bit to lead this organisation?
Well, thank you. And I do understand that that's an issue. And when I've done leadership presentations through my career, then people will generally raise this as an issue. I think, having had nearly 40 years experience in the Royal Air Force, my experience was not of a intensely hierarchical organisation. It's my experience of an organisation where, yes, we have hierarchy and we have ranks, and that's part of our ethos and our tradition. But as much as we possibly can, then what we're interested in is the experience, the knowledge, the skills that the individual can bring. And the challenge is, how do you bring that out to the benefit of the organisation? I think that particularly applies in the aviation area, is that we aim in aviation to have as flat a hierarchy as possible. We need people, wherever they are in the organisation, if they see something which is not right, to mention it, do something about it. We positively encourage and create that environment. And if I might, as an example, is when I was the Chief of the Air Staff, I was determined to stay current on one of the frontline aircraft types, the one that I flew past, the Tornado. And in order to do that, I had to do a constant series of check rides. And sometimes it was the most junior people were there doing my checking, even though I was the most senior in the organisation, because we need to flatten that out, and it's about skills and experience rather than a hierarchy. I think what I'd also point out, if I may, is that as the head of the RAF, there were nearly 5,000 civil servants working for me, and probably the same number, in addition to that, of direct employee contractors. So it's not a case of all I'm used to is dealing with people in uniform. And the final thing that I might say is that the orders have their place in any organization, your direction, if you like. And I was talking to a colleague in the fire service recently, and he said, yeah, we have the same. And he said it's less than 5% is to do with orders. In other words, you must do this because there is a safety critical issue or action must be taken now. More than 95% of the time, it is done by persuasion, motivation, encouragement, people doing what you want them to do, not because you tell them, but because they want to do it. And that is the essence of leadership from my perspective. And I think people who know me, who have worked for me, I think they would back that up. So it's definitely not going to be a case of, if you like, going to the Civil Aviation Authority and there's going to be a complete culture change and it's going to feel like a military organization. It would neither be appropriate, nor is it me.
That's very helpful, thank you. Sometimes I think some organisations at times do need a bit of a culture change. From what you've seen of the CAA so far, and thinking about some of the leadership style you've just outlined, the skill set that you've clearly got, do you think there is an element of your experience from within the RAF and the boards you've sat on that the CAA actually should adopt and should change towards?
I mean, it's not really a question that I can answer at the moment because I haven't engaged at below the chair and chief exec level with the Civil Aviation Authority at the moment. So I think that's I'll have to take my evidence and see what the organisation looks like. But looking at it from the outside, there's nothing that I have seen which would in any way lead me to question that the Civil Aviation Authority doesn't fully stand up to its reputation as a world-class aviation regulator. And so the people in the CAA at the moment are clearly doing an excellent job. My task is to make sure we continue in the CAA to be a world-class regulator. But I think what is going to be the biggest challenge is the amount of change that we are now facing. I'm sure we will come on to discuss this shortly, but there's an enormous amount of change and reshaping required. That is going to be our test. Is not just can the CAA do what it's doing at the moment, but what is it going to be able to do in 5-10 years' time? What does it need to do in those time scales as well? I think that is my primary role, working with the rest of the board, working with the chief executive, is to set the direction for the future and ensure that we can get to where we want to go.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Greg. And actually, we've touched on your view of the CAA, and that's exactly the area of questioning that Simon Jupp was going to take up as well.
Good morning, Sir Stephen, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. Now, in responding to our written questions, you described the Civil Aviation Authority as a strong and effective aerospace regulator. What do you currently see as its key strengths?
I believe I said that it was the aviation regulator, and I think there is a difference there we might need to just discuss between aviation and aerospace in terms of responsibilities. So I do think it is a strong and effective regulator. It has that, I think, a world-class reputation. That is based primarily on the skills and talents which are in the organization. Others come to us and look at the model that we operate in the UK and seek to emulate it. So it's based on the quality of the people. It's based on how we are conceived as an organization. The CAA is conceived as an independent safety regulator, accountable to Parliament. But that independence is clearly an important part of doing its function as well.
On that basis, what do you perceive as its current weaknesses, for example?
Well, again, I think it would be wrong of me to try and identify weaknesses at the moment, looking from the outside. I don't know.
You must have perceptions of something that you think, for example, that could be done better.
Well, I mean, there are perceptions that you can read out on social media and other places, but for me to comment at the moment and say, here is a weakness in the CAA which I will go into to address would be inappropriate, I think, to say that, because I just don't have the knowledge. There's the perceptions that people might have the organisations, and then there's the reality. I think a lot of my sense, because I suspect you're about to ask me, so what do you hear those perceptions as? There's always a difficult role for a regulator to play. If a regulator keeps everybody happy, then perhaps we're not doing a thorough enough job. There's always going to be people who are unhappy with the outcome of the decisions which are made by the regulator. I don't seek unhappy people, but they equally, it happens. It's in the way of things. In order to mitigate that risk of unhappiness, it's how the CAA goes about its work. It's not just the regulatory framework, it's how do we apply that regulatory framework. I believe it needs to be as open and transparent as possible. We need to be clear about the evidence that we're looking at. We need to be clear that we have gathered our understanding by speaking to as many relevant stakeholders as possible. And then we go through, and then either the evidence will directly take us to somewhere, or based on the evidence, we will have to make judgments. And we need to be clear about what did we do to apply to make that judgment. At the end of it, people, as I say, may not be happy. Not everybody may be happy with the outcome, but I would hope that they understand and they will see that it is a rational and auditable way that we have arrived at that outcome.
When you were researching for this role, you must have obviously seen the public's perception and the perception that the industry perhaps had of the regulator. Are there any particular perceptions you're keen to squash quickly, if appointed?
Well, I think I may have just touched on it. It is to do with perceptions are quite often to do with how you are judged to do your business and how open and transparent that you are, and how, if you like, do people understand the rationality of the outcome that you've arrived at. I think that related to that is how do you gather your evidence in from stakeholders, and do people feel that they've been included in the process? I think that's something that I will want to look at early on, because that is vital to our reputation as an organisation. How do we do our engagement? How do we build our understanding? What is the public's perception of the CAA? What's the public's knowledge of the CAA? And what might we do about that? I mean, throughout all of this, I do not want it to be a remote regulator. I want to be an engaged, an assisting, an enabling regulator, one which helps develop and promote the aviation sector, but does that in the way which is consistent with its statutory function of providing a safe aviation environment in the United Kingdom.
Do you think that public perception, that perception of the authority, will be under intense scrutiny in the next 12 months, given the scale of challenges the actual industry faces?
I do. In addition to the safety functions, then clearly we have a clear role to look after consumers in every respect. And consumers in civil aviation are feeling pretty bruised at the moment in a number of cases, and across the civil aviation industry, into general aviation as well, people are looking to how are we going to recover from where we are at the moment. People are also interested in how do we take responsibility for our regulation back from EASA. People are looking at, well, how do you recover in an environmentally sustainable way? There's a whole range of things which people, I think, with good justification, will look to the CAA and say, well, you need to provide some leadership here. In conjunction with the Department for Transport, not in any way, if you like, interfering with our basic safety responsibilities, but I think we have a leadership role. People will be looking to us to perform that role.
Thank you, Sir Stephen, and good luck if appointed. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Sir Stephen. And we're actually going to continue with the theme of how you would perform in the role of Chair. And Graham Morris.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Sir Stephen. I would like to follow on some of the answers you gave earlier to my colleagues, Simon Jupp a little earlier, and to Ruth Cadbury, about your independence when you're performing the role of Chair of the CAA as an independent regulator. Could you give the committee some examples from your previous roles where you've had to demonstrate independence both from politicians and from commercial pressures?
Yes, certainly. Let me start with the first, and I'll, I have a very specific example in mind, but I need to be a little bit generic because in my description of it, because there are some particular sort of sensitive issues. But in my previous role in the Ministry of Defence, before I was the Chief of the Air Staff, I spent 4 years in the centre of the Ministry of Defence. Part of my responsibilities there were as a senior responsible owner for a major programme. By major, I mean initial investment of about £12 billion, and for the capabilities going to be in service for decades to come. This was a national project. When I took over as a senior responsible owner in 2012, I set parameters for when we would deliver this capability to operational service, to performance, cost, and time. I was judged at the time to be being quite, conservative, but in the history of the program, I felt that was appropriate. A couple of years later, I was informed that there was very high-level political intent to declare a higher level of ambition when this capability came into service than I was currently planning for. I said that was not possible, and it went back and forward for a while with some quite scratchy sort of conversations. And eventually I said, well, if this higher level of ambition is imposed on the program, I will have to declare the entire program red because it will not be delivered on to performance, cost, and time. And I was accountable to Parliament for the delivery of that program. So that went away, fortunately, and I'm delighted to say that capability is coming into service as a result of a tremendous amount of hard work by thousands of people. That capability will come into service exactly on the schedule which is set in 2012. So there was, that's an example of, it was political pressure because the increased ambition was for those the reasons. And I maintained my independence and said, I cannot agree to this. So I just pause there. I mean, I can offer other examples.
I've got thank you. I know it's difficult when you're giving generic examples, and I want to come back to a particular example. But in these circumstances, have you given any thought to how, as chair of the Civil Aviation Authority, you might bring some new thinking as to how you're going to work to protect and enhance the Civil Aviation Authority's independence?
So again, I need to caveat by my level of knowledge of the organisation, but of the conversations I've had so far, I haven't heard anyone suggest to me that a view that the independence of the CAA is currently under threat. I have consistently been assured that everybody recognises that the CAA has a statutory function and is accountable to Parliament for safety in aviation in the United Kingdom. That is the basis
for the independence of the CAA. Now, how does that translate on a day-to-day basis is, I'm sure this is the case in the organization at the moment, but how would I approach that? Is I would not go around on a day-to-day basis just constantly saying, I am independent, because you have to work with others. And those others from government to across the general aviation, civil aviation sector, airlines, industry, internationally, you have to work with others. My way of working with others is based on it's a very measured approach, very understanding approach. We're clear when we're using evidence, we're clear when we're using judgment along the way. And where there are issues of debate and differences of opinion, I'm not out there to seek a confrontation with people. We're out to have a discussion and persuade, and this is the way that we go. Because everybody knows that ultimately, in the back pocket of the CAA is this statutory function, and sometimes we have to say no. I would have no difficulty saying no if the situation arose, but I wouldn't want that to be a routine way of working, because that's just not how you fulfill that role of assisting and enabling the civil aviation sector.
Thanks for the answer, Sir Stephen, but I wonder if I might just try and be a little more specific. And obviously, I'm not trying to set the scene for you to have a row with government ministers on your appointment, if that's confirmed. But in terms of the CAA to challenge ministers or their decisions, and I'm thinking back to a recent event where the Transport Select Committee were involved in doing an inquiry, and that was in relation to offshore helicopter safety. And you may recall that 33 offshore workers and crew lost their lives in accidents in the North Sea from helicopters. Well, it was the Super Pumas that were transporting workers to installations in the North Sea. And there were concerns, and are concerns, that the CAA were being influenced by financial and commercial pressures in respect of their response to those tragedies. And the Select Committee came out with some specific recommendations, particularly in relation to the need for a full and independent public inquiry, looking at, for example, the commercial pressures on helicopter safety. And I might say the committee at the time said that the inquiry should also look at the role and effectiveness of the CAA in carrying out its role. So I'm also wanting to press you as well in terms of inclusivity, and you touched on it a little earlier, about being independent, recognising the role of the CAA as the regulator. Would you accept how important it is as well, particularly in relation to offshore helicopter safety, to involve the trade unions in discussions in formulating positions?
So I mean, I know of those tragic accidents with the Super Pumas, but I don't know of the detail of the investigation, so it's really hard for me to comment on the detail. But I'm aware of that tragedy. I mean, I think my response to that would be twofold. Firstly, the primary responsibility for running a safe operation lies on those providing the service. That is their responsibility. It's not the CAA's responsibility. The CAA's responsibility is to set the regulatory framework and to assure themselves that operators are working within that framework. But there is the primary responsibility has to be on those providing the service. In terms of the CAA's that oversight, I don't know the specifics of the situation, and it'd be wrong for me to comment on what the CAA may or may not have done in those circumstances. And what I would say is that I would be completely open to scrutiny of the CAA's role.
I mean, this is inherent in the aviation sector, is that when tragic accidents happen, is we need to be open, transparent, understand what happened, learn the lessons, and adapt. So, I can't comment on the specifics of that particular accident, but what I would say is that in any accident, were there to be a question mark over the role that the CAA may have played, we would be as open as we possibly could be, and if we needed to change, then we would learn the lessons and change. That that's the CAA's culture. I'm absolutely certain. It's also the culture across the entire aviation enterprise.
I thank you for that answer, but can I just ask you one more supplementary in relation to this specific issue about safety, regulation, and independence? So, for example, in the government's Aviation 2050 strategy, despite the loss of life in the North Sea and 65 people being rescued from the North Sea, there wasn't any mention of helicopter safety in the 2050 review. In your role, would you be willing to be robust and say to ministers that was an omission, and ensure that your role is truly a robust one in these circumstances?
I enjoy working with people, but I've no difficulty in being robust. And I think my credibility is based on the fact that I work with people as much as possible. And when I say no or have to be robust, they respect that, because they notice that is they built that confidence in me. In relation to particular issues with helicopter safety, I would need to see the evidence. I can't make a judgment on the basis that I haven't seen the evidence. Is where does it take us, and then what is the best thing for us to do? And by us, I mean not just the CAA, but across the aviation enterprise. What is the best thing for us to do in order to better safeguard safety in the future? I mean, if for any accident, for any loss of life, something has not gone as it should have, we need to investigate that thoroughly, and we will take the appropriate action. In terms of your second part of your initial question, which is about the involvement of the trade unions, I don't know at the moment, because I'm not part of the organisation, what role the trade unions play in the consultative process. I have a reasonable amount of experience of being entirely open and inclusive with trade unions from my previous appointments. I see that as part of the entire system of engagement, of understanding viewpoints. The CAA clearly has things like a consumer panel already. I'll be taking a very close look at those sorts of mechanisms, because the last thing I want is a detached regulator. I want the regulator to be engaged, to understand. And in order to understand, it has to do good communications. It needs to engage with all the right stakeholders, understand the complete cross-section of views and opinions before it makes the decisions. And then similarly, those decisions need to be open, transparent, and communicated properly, and our reasoning explained as well. Because as I mentioned earlier to Mr. Jupp, it's just not a case that we're going to keep everybody happy all the time. It'd be lovely if we could do that. But if we're going to do our job properly, then we will have to sometimes take tough decisions which won't please everybody.
Can I just finally ask you, Sir Stephen, and thank you for that, I appreciate that. I'm sure it's duly noted, those responses. This seems to me to be a massive job. And just looking at the job description, it says 2 days per week. Do you think you'll be able to fit all of this into 2 days a week? And how will you balance your other commitments in fulfilling the role as chair?
Well, yes. Needless to say, Mr. Morris, I've been looking at this because it's the environment has changed markedly since I applied. So, will it be possible within 2 days? I mean, there's a sort of yes and no answer. Yes, in as much as I'm very conscious that the CAA has a chief executive. And there is an executive who are there to run the organisation. My role is to chair the board and to provide all which goes with that. It's not going to help the chief executive if the chair is there on a constant basis.
that's just not, that wouldn't be a good model to run. So in a way, I need to make sure that I don't do more than those 2 days. But the flip side of that argument is the scale of the issues which now face the civil aviation sector, which are of an order of magnitude greater than they were when I first applied for this appointment, leads me to suspect that may well take more of my time. Now, how I actually execute that function, well, that's for me to work through. But I've got career-long experience of working the hours necessary to get the job done, and I will apply myself in that way to this one as well.
Thank you, Sir Stephen. I'll hand back to the chair.
Thank you, Graham. And Sir Stephen, we're now going to look at some of your priorities. And to start with, I'll ask Sam Tarry, and then he'll be followed by Chris Loader to ask some questions on that front. Thank you, Sam.
Good morning, Sir Stephen. Fantastic for you to join us. Just thinking ahead, really, obviously you've got a 4-year term. What do you anticipate be your main priorities as the chair over the course of that term?
Well, thank you for the question. So I would say that there are 3 principal priorities for me, looking as I do at the organisation from the outside at the moment. The first priority is that I want to ensure that the CAA continues to be a world-class regulator, aviation regulator, that it continues to enjoy the trust and confidence of government, the public, airlines, aviation and internationally, that continues to fulfill its primary duty, which is to protect the safety of those who fly and those who are on the ground underneath platforms which are flying. So that's my first priority. The second priority is to deal with the rapidly changing environment that we are in at the moment. Now, clearly, the most pressing part of that is COVID, restart and recovery. But actually, I think the broader issue there is how do we generate greater resilience in the aviation sector? Because how does it withstand shocks like this? We need to return from EASA to national regulation by the end of this year. We need to be able to deal with environmental issues and not be distracted from that as we do things like COVID recovery. We need to deal with rapidly changing technology. We need to deal with increasing exploitation of unmanned systems, drones, and the space environment. We need to deal with rising consumer expectations. So there's a whole range of changes there. And I need to make sure that the CAA has the capabilities, the agility, and the adaptability to be able to function in that environment. And then my third priority concerns the people in the CAA, because in order to deliver those 2 earlier priorities, I need to make sure that we can continue to have outstanding people who have the skills, experience, and capabilities in order to deliver all of that. Recognizing that this is not a standstill situation, that the major change is on its way. That also speaks to the CAA itself. I need to ensure that we have the structures, the organizations, and the processes which are going to deal with both number 1 and 2 in the priority list. So those are the 3 headline priorities that I will take into this role if I am confirmed in the appointment. But I am very conscious that when I arrive at the CAA, I will tell everybody that those are my 3, if you like, buckets of priorities. But I now need to listen and understand and adjust as necessary based on the light of the evidence which I gather there.
Thank you. Just to follow up on one aspect of that, obviously the industry is going to be changing probably quite dramatically because not just because of the COVID crisis, but also because of meeting ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets. In the past, the CAA between 2011 and 2014 had actually compiled different data on emissions, air quality, wastewater, etc. But that was abandoned because essentially they couldn't get like-for-like data. So most of the airlines, report just on a kind of sort of in different ways, depending on what they think is appropriate. Do you think that perhaps, given those, the amount of greenhouse gases that are obviously produced in the aviation sector and those ambitious targets set by the government, that perhaps we need to look at finding a way of actually having a standardized way of reporting, and that actually be more of an actual function within the rest of the regulatory framework that the CAA oversees?
So I'm not familiar with that particular work which you described, which I think you said continued till, was it 2014? I'm not familiar with that particular piece of work. But I think overall, then I do feel that how do we provide a coherent framework around the entire enterprise, which assists in achieving that set target of net zero emissions by 2050. I do see the need for a more all-encompassing framework. And I do believe that the CAA will have a vital role to play in that. There's clearly an enormous number of stakeholders involved, so this isn't me sort of going out in some sort of land grab. But I absolutely see the need for a coherent strategy. I think in a way it's particularly sharpened by the recovery from COVID. There is. It'd be wrong for me to describe this as an opportunity, but what it does allow us to consider is when we're at a very low level, about 10% of normal sort of civil aviation traffic, it does allow us to consider when we go from that 10% back up to the 100% level, which is clearly going to take us some time. How do we do that in a way which both restarts the industry in the way that we all want, with all of the benefits associated with that, but also puts us on the right track to guaranteeing that we can achieve those targets which have already been set.
Thank you, Sir Stephen.
Chris.
Thank you, Chairman. Sir Stephen, good morning. Thank you very much for taking the time to come and speak to us. I have just a few questions, if I may. I wanted to ask your opinion, really, first of all, in regard to the CCA. Do you believe it's adequately delivering today?
Sorry, the CAA. You said CCA?
Yeah, the CAA, yeah.
I do believe that it is delivering at the moment. As its primary role is to protect the safety of people who fly and people who are on the ground. I believe it does that effectively and efficiently. Now, it's in the nature of the enterprise that you should never be satisfied. Anybody who says that they are satisfied about how we do safety is perhaps not got their eye on the ball enough. So we must constantly look for ways of getting better, providing better safety, and if you look at the trajectory over decades, that is absolutely what is being delivered. So against its primary role, I believe that the CAA is doing a good job. But I know that the people in the CAA would also say, yeah, but we always need to try and get better.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Do you think the CAA will need to adapt how it operates, particularly sort of post-COVID? And I'm thinking specifically with regards to the regulatory framework.
I mean, I could ask just what you have particularly in mind in relation to the regulatory framework. I mean, I think I could give a generic answer which says that I can have to adapt, but I'd rather sort of be more specific.
Yeah, well, clearly, I mean, the regulatory framework, particularly when it comes to allocating capacity, is going to be of increasing importance, I think, over the coming months, not least because we're seeing airlines considerably reduce the number of flights. We're seeing, some airports, indeed, there are some airlines who've pulled out of some airports, Virgin, I think, for Gatwick, for example. Clearly, the regulatory framework that says certain airlines can hold on to certain landing slots when they are, publicly declaring they're not going to use that airport anymore. That's the sort of thoughts that I'm having in terms of the regulatory framework.
Okay, all right. Thank you for that. I mean, I think just it will be important in all of that is that there are a range of regulatory frameworks we're talking about here. Not all of them are owned by the CAA, and we just need to be clear in our own minds and across everybody who's working on this is that who has responsibility, who has the capabilities to discharge those responsibilities. So I need to be careful that I'm not encroaching on what's the responsibility of others. But I think the point overall is as we do this restart and recovery, is there going to be a need for extra capacity and effort devoted to making sure that the regulatory framework which exists at the moment continues to be robust and is, if you like, applicable for the circumstances that we are in. So let me give an example is, it's now 3 months nearly since we had large-scale civil air traffic movements. That lack of recency affects air traffic controllers, it affects pilots, it affects cabin crew, it affects aircraft engineers, it affects ground handling. The entire ecosystem of civil aviation is out of practice. Now, from an aviation background, in fact, any background, a lack of recency in a highly complex and demanding thing has got to be a concern. So what the CAA needs to make sure is that the standards haven't changed, but if the regulatory framework hasn't changed, but the input of things into that framework has changed. We need to make sure we're doing this in a measured and paced way such that the safety of the public and consumers is not in any way reduced. Now, again, I'm not in the organization at the moment, but I'm very much aware that the CAA is part of all of those discussions and debates about restart and recovery. And I know that will be something which they will be emphasizing in this debate.
So, thank you. So in your opinion, is what I really want to understand. Do you believe the regulatory framework needs to evolve from this point on because of the enormously changing environment which we're working, or do you think the framework we have is reasonably adequate? I suppose is what I really want to know. So
my basic sense is that the aviation safety framework.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was really in the economic framework.
I was going, yeah, exactly the point I was going to make. I thought that's what was in your mind. So, I mean, the clear issues in relation to refunds, the consumers' rights is perfectly clear. Consumers are entitled to a refund for cancelled flights. Now, I can understand how airlines will have a difficulty coping with that, not just in terms of a financial impact, but just in terms of numbers of people. I mean, the number of claims for refunds are extraordinary, hundreds, probably thousands of times more than you normally expect. And meanwhile, they've got large numbers of their staff furloughed, and so their ability to handle those claims is much lower. But nevertheless, people have a right, and the CAA will stand up to that right. I think the challenge, though, and getting to the heart of your question is, so that framework is there, but why are people so unhappy? It's the time taken for resolution. Excuse me. And ultimately, the CAA can take legal action, but it takes an extraordinarily long length of time, which potentially acts as a deterrent for consumers. And CAA has a clear duty to look after consumers' interests there.
Yes.
So can I see the possibility of the CAA asking for increased regulatory authority in order to ensure that consumers' rights are protected in this area? I can see that happening, but the timescale for that, I think, is one to be developed.
Thank you. The balance of safety and economic priorities, is clearly something quite I've worked for the railways for the last 20 years before being elected here a few months ago, and I'm very familiar with the similar sort of regulatory framework in which we have, and particularly for CAA, where you have the safety and economic regulation. In terms of balancing those priorities, do you have anything specifically you'd like to mention about balancing those two priorities?
The safety of people who fly and people underneath will always take the highest priority. That is our statutory duty as the CAA. I think that potentially the biggest challenge, as ever, comes on those who are operating. Airlines, for example. But as I mentioned earlier in this hearing, is the primary responsibility lies on them, and so we need to make sure that in that safety versus economics balance, that they are absolutely in the right place as well. Now, I don't want that to sound in any way confrontational. That's not my approach. It is entirely in the CAA's interest. It's in everybody's interest to have a healthy, vibrant civil aviation, general aviation sector in the United Kingdom. And I want the CAA to be doing everything it can to help enable and assist that, but it will not compromise on its primary objective, which is to protect people's lives.
Thank you. And finally, from me, my colleague Graham Morris asked you earlier about your 2 days a week. Now, this role attaches a good salary for 2 days a week of £130,000 a year. It's a lot of money. I just finally wanted to ask you whether you think you're good value for that money.
Well, my response to that would be, firstly, I didn't read the salary before I read the job description, so I'm interested in the job. Whether I am worth it or not, I'll have to leave that for others to judge. As I mentioned earlier, it's unlikely that I'll only be doing 2 days a week in the job. But I will leave it to others to judge. And perhaps if I were to be appointed and I'm subsequently held to account by this committee, then you'll be able to tell me whether you think I'm worth it or not.
I should be delighted to be able to answer that question for you in 6 months' time, should you be appointed. Of which I wish you the very best of luck, and I hope that you will come and speak to us maybe in 5 or 6 months' time and tell us how you're finding things. I certainly would greatly appreciate that. Thank you.
And likewise, if I might, Chair, I would welcome that opportunity in 6 months to come back, because I am conscious that a number of the questions you have rightly asked me, I have responded with, I don't yet know, but I'm going to find out. In 6 months' time, I really ought to know, and be very happy for you to hold me to account on that basis.
Thank you. Chairman, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And thank you, Sir Stephen, on that point. I mean, we've always worked very closely with your predecessors, and Dame Deirdre has been before us, and we have a particular focus at the moment on aviation, and we're determined to sort of look back on it as well when we've got more time to reflect. So we'll no doubt be seeing you if you're in your role. And I should also just point out, I think you would be too modest to say so, that your salary is the exact same salary level as your predecessor has been on. There's not been any uplift. We want to talk about some key issues for aviation, because obviously it's very topical. We're sort of mindful, to your point, about not yet being in post, but we'd be really interested in some of your views on this front. So I'm going to first of all ask Robert Largan to start us off on this section, and then Gavin Newlands. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Steve, for coming in, and thanks for your service as well. I was going to ask about the target for carbon neutral by 2050, but my colleague Sam Tarry has already asked that, and you've given quite a lengthy response. But seeing as today is World Environment Day, it'd be interested to have your thoughts, perhaps further on that target, and how you think the Civil Aviation Authority should respond to environmental concerns.
So, I mean, I'm not sure there is too much I can add at this stage to the earlier answer. apart from to underline that we all know this is a critical issue for the aviation sector. That those targets, 2050 is quite a long way away against a pressing global problem, and that we need to get a move on. I think it's also fair to point out how much progress has already been made through more efficient aircraft engines and the like. So we are making a lot of progress, but that in a large measure has been offset by the increase, up until recently, the increase in demand. So it's a really difficult thing to work through here, but I don't think that there is anybody who underestimates the importance of this challenge, the degree of scrutiny which is rightly being applied to it, and the need for the aviation sector to respond. And everybody has signed up to those targets. In relation to the CAA's role in this, again, as I said to Mr. Tarry, this is about working out who is going to provide the framework for all of those targets, goals, and ambitions to fit within. And I'm not going to claim that the CAA has the ownership of all of that at the moment, but we need to work out who is going to hold the ring, who is going to set the targets across the aviation enterprise, who's going to do the holding to account along the way. So I'm conscious it sounds a little bit like my previous answers, but I'm not sure I have too much more to offer at the moment, except to underline absolutely get the importance of this. And we definitely need to make sure that the recovery from COVID does not distract us from the importance of those targets.
Thanks, Steve. I just wanted to add, really appreciate the answer and all the answers that you've given today. You've definitely got a very impressive CV and a lot of experience. And I think you do a fantastic job at the CAA. Thank you very much. Back to Chair.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. And we'll carry on this same vein with Gavin Newlands. Gavin.
Thanks very much, Chair. Obviously, the UK will be leaving EASA at the end of this year, the end of the transition period. What challenges do you foresee for the Civil Aviation Authority? One challenge, for example, could be the fact that the Brexit negotiations have stalled and the chance that no deal on aviation regulation or market access is agreed. What challenges do you see?
Well, clearly there are, there are definitely big challenges there for sure. We have been in EASA, and gradually EASA has taken more of our national responsibilities. We've been on that track for decades, and now we are changing. And the government in the UK and the European Union itself has been clear that we will be leaving EASA. Now, so at one level that represents some degree of risk. How do you mitigate that risk? Well, firstly, I think by recognizing just what the capabilities that the CAA already has, the degree that the CAA has contributed to EASA over the years with its knowledge and expertise. And on the basis of that, I think we can have confidence that we will be able to do this. And it's not we're starting from a blank sheet of paper. The sheet of paper has EASA written on it at the moment, so I can put it that way. And so we are working from that as our baseline. And then what do we need to do in order to take our national responsibilities, to still have relationships with things like EASA, and clearly we've got a relationship with ICAO and the like. Now that's all going to take more capacity of the CAA than we had previously, because there were functions done Europe-wide. We, the CAA, have been recruiting people to make sure that we do have the capacity to do that work, and that we do have the skills and experience that we need. Now, I haven't seen the detail of that work yet. It will be a very high priority for me to see it once if I'm confirmed in appointment. But from everything that I've seen and knowing the background,
then I am confident that we are successfully mitigating any risks which arise.
Okay, thanks for the answer. You're correct in what you're saying, that the EASA has benefited from a fair amount of CAA experience, expertise and experience over the years. But at the end of the year, the CAA is going to have to take a significant step up, both in workload and responsibilities. How are you going to ensure that you have all the experienced staff at the end of the year and not sometime after that?
Well, I know that the process is already well underway. So, notwithstanding the current recruitment challenges in relation to COVID, the people are already a lot of people have already been recruited in to do this work. In terms of how we make sure that it happens, I need to get into the organisation to see the evidence. I need to recognise this. The chief exec has absolutely got this in his sights. I am confident it will be done through a series of staged progress markers and tests that we will set upon ourselves to make sure that we have the capacity to achieve the standards that we need to achieve. We will be doing that throughout the rest of this year, so that when we actually take over the responsibility formally, we can have confidence that we'll be in good shape. Now, this will be an evolving picture for sure. We will need to recruit more people. I'm certain there is always a challenge getting people with these skills and experience. But I come back to the fact that the CAA is good at this sort of activity. We're not starting from scratch here. We're building on a vast amount of existing experience and knowledge.
Okay, thanks. You mentioned obviously the relationship with EASA, and whatever happens at the end of the year, that's obviously going to be key, as with the arrangements with the other international organisations. What experience do you have with working with counterparts from other countries within an international framework?
A lot of experience is the short answer. In relation to NATO or bilateral relationships, there's an extensive network of military relationships which I have been a part of throughout my career. In my previous job, there was a lot of discussion with colleagues in European air forces about what would the impact be of the UK leaving the European Union. And together we agreed that the basis of our relationship was not between the air forces in the air environment, was not through the EU. It was on those bilateral, multilateral organizations. Not just in relation to the European Union, but it's around the world as well. And in my previous appointment, I was in that appointment for 3 years, and I visited 41 countries around the world, 18 of them on more than one occasion. And so, I would say I've got a decent amount of experience of dealing with international bodies. I'd also say that, just in case that sounds very, military or Air Force-like, that I have extensive experience in equipment acquisition. In other words, working with major defense companies. The majority of those major defense companies are international. The majority of our acquisition is international. So it's dealing with companies overseas as well as air forces, indeed dealing with governments overseas also.
Okay, thanks. And lastly, from me, Chair, the expansion of the CAA's responsibilities will take some significant restructuring at the body, some of which will undoubtedly be underway under the current leadership. But what experience do you have in organisational restructuring? And what experience have you gained from your previous roles that would help you to lead this change effectively?
So, any organisation, any decent organisation always has to be in a process of change or transformation to some degree, otherwise you lose your relevance. Perhaps the best example I could give you is one which is in relation to the Ministry of Defence. wherein, as a result of the 2010 Defence Review, I then did work with a civil service colleague in designing a future operating model for how we did military capability planning and financial delegation. So she and I spent a year designing a new way of doing business, which was essentially taking it away from a highly centralized Ministry of Defence function and delegating it out to the individual services. That went live in early 2013, and it is still the model which Defence follows now. It involved the disaggregation of a large number of people, a significant amount of responsibility, and probably about 12 to 14 billion pounds worth of annual spend. So it was a significant undertaking. Once that delegation had happened, or as part of that delegation, myself and my civil service colleague, she and I then had to do an internal Ministry of Defence reorganisation in our area to ensure that we had the capabilities to do the balance of investment decisions, the allocation of resources and the setting of targets, and then also within that delegated model, still having a, if you like, a coherence function where we could join, make sure that we just didn't have random bits across the fence. We could actually still join together in a whole. That for me was a major strategic restructuring, a complete change of philosophy in how we did business. So it was initiated in 2010. I didn't initiate it, but initiated in 2010. I worked on it in 2011. I implemented it in 2012, 2013, and it's still running in 2020. I don't see any prospect for change. So I think that was a success and an example, which is hopefully is helpful to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Sir Stephen. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Gavin. Ruth, I think you wanted just to come back on something. You're on mute, Ruth. I think you'll need to unmute yourself. Sorry.
Okay. Yes. Thank you. I represent a constituency that's very much affected by flag operations, and for years we've found that the CAA has not been particularly helpful in issues such as noise and environmental pollution, even to some extent safety as well, to do with its remit. It is more limited now. I know the CAA's remit is expanding, but is it enough? And a lot of that goes down to what we see as the tension between the public sector and the public responsibility and the private sector. And I just wondered how you feel, how you could navigate that tension between the public and the private, public and the commercial.
So Stephen, before you respond, Ruth, just so you know, you were breaking up a bit there. I think Stephen will have the gist of what you said, but if he's not absolutely answered every part, I think it will be because he couldn't hear everything that was said. So we'll see how we get on.
Well, thank you, Chair, and I'm sorry, but I didn't catch all of it. But I got the gist of it. Is how do you balance off public and private concerns? And my honest answer is, there's no template. There is a clear head mark, though, and that head mark is that the CAA's primary responsibility is to protect the public, those who fly and those who are underneath things that do fly. I am absolutely clear in my mind that my job, working with the board, working with the executive, is to discharge that number one responsibility. Now, we also have other, sorry, I should say, and that is what I'm held to account by Parliament. But I also have other responsibilities, along with a whole range of other stakeholders, about promoting or assisting and enabling the aviation sector. I don't believe these are incompatible. Every organisation has to, have those debates within it. But I come back to my responsibility primary responsibility is to protect the public. And if hard decisions need to be made, which may not be popular with the private sector, then through the processes I've talked about earlier. We'll understand all the points of view. If ultimately, if hard decisions need to be made, I know what my primary responsibility is. Sorry, I didn't get at much of the detail behind the question, but hopefully that gets at what you were asking.
No, that's fine, because it was a top level question. So
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So Stephen, perhaps I can ask. I mean, I'm sure when you started this process off, airline or airport expansion might have been at the top of the sort of list of questions that might come up in the interview stage. You know, how we can get more entrance into the sort of airspace. And now, obviously, some months on, we're looking at what could be a sort of vastly declining aviation sector. Perhaps no airport expansion, perhaps we lose more airlines, perhaps we struggle with competition and therefore end up seeing higher prices, and a need for a new angle on safety, which is all about sort of passenger health safety. You know, previously, the UK has led the field when it comes to global aviation safety. So sort of how do you feel now in terms of your what you need to do with your organisation versus what you may have thought when you started off this job interview process?
Yes, I mean, it's something I've clearly reflected on quite a lot. I think that the three priorities which I outlined earlier continue to exist. So I don't see that fundamentally that we're going to go away from that. That is about maintaining, you know, world-class regulator standards. It's about being able to change, and it's about ensuring people to make that happen. I don't see that fundamentally changing. But a lot of the issues which sit below that, particularly in relation to change, there has been a lot of movement in them clearly. When I look at well, where does this take us in the long term? I don't think anybody at the moment can accurately forecast how the civil aviation sector is going to recover. I mean, there's various dates which I know have been put out there by various parties, but the honest answer is, nobody knows. I would say that we have got there have been challenges in the past. 9/11 would be an example where, not of the same scale, but again, a strategic shock to the airline system, and it has recovered from that point. Now, that was a past example. What the timeline is for this one, we don't know yet. In relation to what does that mean for issues like airport capacity, I mean, unless we assume that we are now going to adopt a permanently lower level of air transport, unless we assume that, then you can absolutely see that there is an enduring need to look at airspace and at airport capacity, particularly in the southeast of the country, and work out what our strategy is for the future. The one thing that the COVID has resulted in is that, as you rightly pointed out, Chair, the timeline is just not as pressing now, because that point of critical capacity is further away from us than it was, say, 3-4 months ago. It's very hard to predict, I think, where this is going to end up. I instinctively, I mentioned about unless we accept that air travel isn't going to recover to where it was. I don't accept that. I do believe it will recover, and I do believe it will grow. I don't know over what timeline that is. One of the key challenges, though, is to make sure clearly we have a sufficiently healthy aviation sector with enough competition in there that it can make that recovery, and it can do it in a way which continues to look after consumers' rights, and we don't price people out of the market, because then it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And just finally from me, there is a sort of concern that you touched on competition. We could end up in a situation where competition is lessened, and that means that it's harder for new entrants to come into the market with those that have got particularly valuable landing slots and the like. I mean, do you commit to using all levers at your disposal in order to build up competition in the aviation sector should it become reduced in the coming months?
We have a duty, and we're answerable to the public to look after consumers' interests. Consumers' interest is best served by the right safety environment and by the right competitive environment to give them choice. I think the key part you mentioned there within the levers that we have at our disposal. And I'm conscious that there are a number of others who will also be keen to work with us on this. So within the levers that we have at our disposal, the CAA, then absolutely, that is for me a vital part of ensuring that we have a healthy aviation enterprise going forward.
Thank you, Carl. You had to drop off, but did you want to add anything at all?
Only just to say thank you very much indeed, and congratulations to Sir Steve. We have some mutual friends. I'm very pleased for you. And just wondered, it's a bit of a curveball question, I suppose, but anything you want to say about your predecessor's time that you might have done differently?
I thank you for giving me that opportunity, because I would just like to say that I think Dame Deirdre has done a fantastic job from everything that I can see. We had occasional interactions when I was chief of the air staff. She's been in the CAA for a number of years now, and everybody speaks extremely highly of her and her ability to chair the board, and the achievements that she has secured over the last I think it's 11, 12 years now are truly impressive. So I'm very conscious that I have, quite a thing to do to live up to what she has achieved. But inevitably, the new look on things equals, that's why we change over people, is to keep bringing in fresh ideas, fresh perspectives. And once if I'm appointed, then once I have got a better understanding of the organisation, then I will try and take it forward and to that next level up, and continuously improve the CAA in the way that Dame Deirdre has already.
Thank you for that, and well done. Back to you, Chairman.
Thank you, Carl. So, Stephen, thank you so much. That concludes our questioning. I just wanted to, again, echo the other members. Thank you for attending today under these circumstances. Thank you also for the fulsome answers that you've given to our questions. And also, thanks for all the public service that you've given to date as well. Our process means that we fold back to the Department for Transport with our views, which we will do so forthwith. But if everything works all the way through, we'd certainly be very keen to get your experiences again once you've got your feet under the desk, as it were. So thank you to you, best wishes, and just concludes for me to say order, order.